Hello and welcome to this final video on Heidegger's Being and Time. So the last video was the last chapter of the book, but I wanted to make one last video to try to summarize my thoughts and give some last remarks on the book. And going back to the original question, what Heidegger set out to do in Being and Time, you could say that he either set out to give an answer to the question of what is being in general. Or you could say he was less ambitious and that his only goal was to awaken the sense of the question of being in the modern person. And to the first goal, it's pretty clear that he did not succeed. He did not come with a general question of being. And I can say that because the answer to that question was ultimately deferred to a division 3 of Being and Time, which was never written. He never got around to do that throughout his whole life. Whether that is because he couldn't come up with an answer, or he didn't take his time, or he gave up on the project, who knows? But yeah, it wasn't written. Now, did he awaken a sense of the question of being? It's also hard to say, for me personally now, whether that appears as a legitimate and interesting question outside of understanding what other people have arrived at in this questioning. But to go back to what he's trying to get at with being and what he's not trying to say, I wanted to go back to the very beginning of the book and just read again his take on the question of being for the modern man. So starting at page 1. On the basis of the Greek point of departure for the interpretation of being a dogma has taken shape, which not only declares that the question of the meaning of being is superfluous, but even sanctions its neglect. It is said that being is the most universal and the emptiest concept. As such, it resists every attempt at definition, nor does this most universal and thus indefinable concept need any definition. Everybody uses it constantly and also already understands what is meant by it. Thus, what troubled ancient philosophizing and kept it so by virtue of its obscurity has become obvious and clear as day, such that whoever persists in asking about it is accused of an error of method. And I also want to mention the notes from Pascal on this question, which is part of the footnotes of page 3. Pascal. One cannot undertake to define being without falling into this absurdity. For one cannot define a word without beginning in this way. It is ... This beginning may be expressed or implied. Thus, in order to define being, one must say it is, and hence employ the word to be defined in its definition. So I did think that Heidegger initially did make a good, a nice representation of why this question seems so strange to us. That he understood that, which made me hopeful before going into the book. But yeah, I didn't think that he really got around to getting it, awakening this sense of the question. But there is another nice summary of what Heidegger is not meaning by being, what he's trying to get away from, which is something that I heard from a conversation with John Vervaeke on Being and Time. So he mentioned 4 definitions of being, which were all subsequently rejected as what being is. So the first one was we can talk about being as different beings, as different entities, which is perhaps the most obvious one. Secondly, we could talk about the origin of being, which is usually the supreme being, like it would be about God in that sense, the original being. Then it was about being as the most abstract of concept, that it's at the top of the hierarchy of geniuses of concepts. That is also rejected. And then we could talk about being as beingness, as the property of all beings, that when they have their beingness, and what is beingness. That is not what Heidegger wants to get at either. And Vervaeke, I think, rightly then asks, well, or he represents the viewer wrestling with this question, that, well, what is left if none of these things are what we're talking about? And then it goes on in an hour-long conversation, not really getting at it still. But I will try to go over a few of the themes of being in time that have interested me, and that have that I might have some comments and disagreements with. So the first question that I want to bring up is whether Heidegger really believes that beings are what I would call real in themselves, so that they exist in themselves. It's a question of whether there is a reality independent of perception, independent of Dasein. And the way that Heidegger has sets it up is that, what he calls reality, that is something which is dependent on Dasein. There is no reality without Dasein. But the real is something which exists still without Dasein. So it's not a pure idealism where everything, the world is only when, well, you can't even say the world, because of course for Heidegger, the world is only with Dasein, but there is something without Dasein as well. But the thing that is not so clear to me is whether there really are beings in themselves without Dasein for Heidegger. So what I mean by that is how Dasein works, or how we come to perceive the world and to sort of categorize the world into different beings. That categorization is based off the structure of relevance and significance. And relevance is how the different tools, you could say, are connected in a network. So his classic example is that we have hammers, that are for hammering nails, and nails are for building, putting planks together, and putting planks together is to build a house and so forth, and this structure of what things are for. And then on top of that, you have the structure of significance, which is more about this is all for the sake of Dasein. And it is this structure of relevant significance that organizes the world. And that I very much agree with, and that description resonates strongly with me. But outside of that categorization into different beings, is that categorization purely a property of, or a consequence of Dasein, or is there something in that organization that is inherent to the real for Heidegger? he tries to be clear that there is not this ideal object in themselves. That when he talks about the picture on the wall, and that anything which attempts to, or any description of reality that says that what we mean by the picture on the wall is something other than the phenomenon that we experience, that is wrong. There is no ideal object which we only sort of interpret, or we do interpret, but that there is the real thing, and we only get this flawed, filtered perception of the real thing. That doesn't seem to be Heidegger's position. It is what it is that we experience, that is the object that we are always talking about, not something veiled behind. But there is still then this sense of, well, the picture still exists as an entity in some form outside of before Heidegger, or before Dasein. And I've come to realize that for me, I don't think the real, what I would call it then, or I would try to connect with Heidegger's sense of the real, doesn't contain any beings. I think for structuring the world into beings is a property of perception, but it's something inherent in the world. So I would, if I have this object, it seems to be as a separate thing from the world around it, and we do that because, well, the differences in color and texture, and it just seems to, when it moves around, everything goes with, sort of follows it, so it seems to be a compact body. But to me, there's nothing inherently sort of the identity of this being as an entity is something that I that I bring to it. There is nothing. In reality, there is nothing separating. You can't even say separating the thing, because there is no thing really. There's only the totality of reality, essentially, and we try to compact that in a way that is relevant for us, and that's how we get different beings. Is what I would say. So when I started to try to understand Heidegger's being and time, I did that, I think, through partly this video series from Hubert Dreyfus. And he put a lot of emphasis on these three types of beings that is brought up in Being and Time: Dasein, present at hand things, and objective things and tools, others outside of Dasein. And the tool part, I didn't think I thought there would be more details on that part in particular than what I found, and especially this phenomenon of withdrawal of the tools when we use them skillfully. And that is a phenomenon that is interesting, and is there is definitely something true to that. That when you're using a tool skillfully, when you don't have to think of how to use it, but it comes so natural to you that it becomes transparent to you, and it's just an extension of you. And anyone that is trying to master something probably recognizes that as well, and feels that when you're really doing something correctly, then it's like effortless. In other words, like it just comes natural, and there is no thinking. But I also realized that what Heidegger really meant by tools is not really what I initially thought. See, his examples of tools are typically related to carpentry, the hammers and the nails. And it is always something that is have a predefined purpose. Like the hammer is obviously used for meant for hammering, and the activity is a physical activity, I would also add, and it is something that you can repeat and master. Now, what I don't, what I disagree with is that, or I don't know if Heidegger means that a thing that I guess the structure of relevance is what I'm thinking about now. That sure, we know that the hammer is for hammering, but it's pretty obvious that the hammer can be used for multiple other purposes, and that we can sort of in the moments when things change, and we are faced with a new unexpected turn of events, a new challenge that requires a new tool set, that we can use tools in new ways. Like if I wanted to, say, break into a house for some reason, then a hammer could be great for, breaking down a window. Which is obviously not what it was meant for, but it can still be used to that purpose. So when Heidegger says that things have their relevance, I'm not sure if he is very strict about the initial design, the designed purpose of the tool. And again, all of the tools that he mentions are tools for physical activities of some sort that you can repeat and master. But if I were to again bring up this fake apple and try to, in kind of a meta way, try to use this as a tool to illustrate a point about the deficiencies of Heidegger's analysis of tools. Now, what type of being does this apple have? I mean, this is not an activity that you could repeat and master, probably. This is like a very unique use of this tool, and it was obviously not designed for this. And maybe it's, I'm most definitely not using it skillfully in a way that it withdraws from me, but to actually observe it is part of its of how I'm using it in order to re-examine its being. So what would Heidegger say about this? Is this a tool, or is this a purely just an objective thing, and the activity is completely sort of within in my head, so to say. There's nothing going on with this objective thing. There's no like new type of being inserted to it. I don't know the answer, honestly. But I know that in later Heidegger, he does at least bring up, or I believe he does bring up at least one more kind of being, and that is the being of works of art, which I haven't read anything on yet, but that would be also an interesting angle of this analysis of different types of being, that what is an artwork, and how does that connect with Dasein. Again, talking about this structure of relevance, there is a consistent point throughout Being and Time that we have these primordial primordial ways of viewing the world that is different from a scientific worldview, which I also very much agree with. But I also find the point to be kind of trivial, honestly, in that, well, if you think about how we normally think of space and time, that the most natural way to think of these things is not in terms of centimeters and seconds and hours. Of course, now that has become that is such a useful way of thinking about things. So I'm guessing that most people still use these measurements of space and time in their daily life. But the primary relation to these dimensions is that, well, is this thing far away? Is this thing near me? Is this thing within my reach? Is this thing happening right now? Is this thing happening after sunrise? Did this thing happen before I woke up? Like, these are the categories that is like natural to think of, and that we don't see things as this sort of dead material stuff, as like this scientific worldview, because he feels the need to counter a worldview like this. But yeah, when people are being honest with themselves, I don't think that is how any of us really see the world if we're not sort of hardcore scientists. So it's like I agree with what Jordan Peterson said on his old video lecture series on Heidegger, that because he uses Heidegger as a source for the theory of perception, which is I think appropriate. A lot of Being in Time boils down more to a description of perception and cultural, psychological structures, I could say, rather than being. And Jordan said in that lecture series that, well, when we see a cliff, we don't see, like a distance of meters and an angle and the raw material of the earth below it or something like that. We see a falling off place. We see that beyond that point, I can fall down and die. That is what we primarily perceive. And so I think the primacy of that worldview is correct. I would say that the concept in Being in Time that I have the most issue with is this concept of attunement. Every time I go over it, I'm surprised by how little it makes sense to me. So Dasein is always in this state of attunement, or some state of attunement, some mood that we are attuned with. And this mood always has a certain understanding of the world, or it gives us some understanding. And all of these things are meant to be something that we do not choose, that we do not does not emerge from us, that we do not have because of prior experiences, but it's something that just comes over us because of the world that we've been born into, I guess. And the way that we are attuned, that determines how we are able to perceive the world, what type of things or type of beings that we are able to come into view for us. And it is not an emotion, and it is not. I want to say that it's not experienced, but he does. But then he does have his key mood of anxiety, and that one clearly seems to be something that people can experience. So it is not purely a pre-experiential phenomenon. Now, if he had kept this concept both vague and that moods can overlap, and that that he did not try to define them in like different discrete moods, but has kept that even that vague as well. Then it would have made more sense to me, and it because at some level I do think that what we can perceive, what possibilities that we can see in the world is partly restricted of, well, the social and cultural environment that we are surrounded by. So things like the ideas of what it means, what it can mean to be a person, or how a society can be structured, or what culture can be, how you can behave. The fact that we would be limited in our understanding of these things based on the culture around us that we have been born into, sure, that seems pretty reasonable to me, and I think that is something that later thinkers inspired by Heidegger would probably say as well. But Heidegger, he does bring up some examples of different moods, and all of them are, well, they are not emotions, but he uses the names of emotions. A joyful mood, a fearful mood, a anxious mood, a happy mood, maybe, I don't know. And his example of fear is very, very strange to me, that we perceive an object that we fear because we're in a fearful mood, which suggests that if we weren't in this fearful mood, that we wouldn't be able to, well, see this fearful thing. And again, that would make sense kind of if you were thinking of maybe some like a social fear of a group in society, this kind of constant lingering like fear that makes you more suspicious towards people, kind of like that. Yeah, maybe, and that's something that you could be get from your culture and be born into. But if you would take the example of like an actual predator that's like sneaks up on you in the forest, you would encounter an animal of some kind, and then suddenly be scared and start fearing for your life. I mean, how do you explain that in Dasein, in Heidegger's system? That you would were you always fearful? Did you become in the fearful mood the moment that you needed to? From his description, it would seem like if we weren't in the fearful mood, which we don't have control over, the mood comes over us, we don't decide it ourselves, then we wouldn't be able to see the thing or experience it as threatening, which obviously is not how things work in reality. So yeah, the whole idea of attunement doesn't make much sense to me. Then there is Heidegger's separation of inauthentic and authentic being, which runs throughout all of Being and Time, but he goes to explain authentic being mainly in Division 2. And he says that, well, we are all, for the most part, in this inauthentic mode. And he calls it inauthentic, which today sounds like something that we should avoid and get away from. No one wants to be inauthentic today. But he stresses over and over again that this state is not a morally inferior one. It is not something that we can escape. It is not something that we should try to get rid of. It is not something to look down upon or inferior or anything like that. But his language throughout Being and Time it is inevitable to see the authentic mode as the one that we should strive for, that is preferable. And partly why he cannot say that inauthentic mode of being is bad is that it is inescapable for Heidegger. And so if he had said that it was a reprehensible or not, maybe too strong of a word there, but that is something that we should escape and look down upon. He cannot say that because, well, we cannot escape it. So we would be kind of doomed if that was our since that is our fate. And his description of the inauthentic mode of being is the identification with the they, and the fact that we are, for the most part, not ourselves, but we are the they. We are, in German, das Man, or in English you would say as one is, or in Swedish, som man är. So this idea of man translates pretty well to Swedish. Now, does this description of the inauthentic modes of being resonate with people, resonate with me? Yeah, sure. You could see how we think of the average way that one should be to deal with things in terms of what one should do in this situation, relying on the culture and the people around you, the community, and sort of work towards the average interpretation and solution and opinion, and for it all to become more, or wishing for it all to become the same, you could say. Yeah, I mean, I sure, I recognize those things as social phenomenon, but he makes it seem that this other type of mode of being, the authentic mode of being, is so distinctly different from being inauthentic, and that you would have to go through these key steps to achieve authentic being, which I don't think is the case at all. So to get away from this inauthentic mode of being, when you identify with the they, you would hear the call of your conscience, which tells you that you are a null ground. You are like who you are is not you cannot rely on your culture to answer the question of who you are. You don't have like a there is no fixed platform for you to that you can use in the culture to base your being upon, and that we are guilty in the sense that we are not our own ground, that we are reliant on the culture always to come into every situation with something beforehand. And then we have this key attunement of anxiety, this experience of everything losing its significance, and the subsequent freedom that is followed through that things did not have to be in any certain way, which means that we can have to choose that the way that things are. And then this being toward death, this grasping of your own death as a unique and deeply personal event, and not just a like death in general, but your own mortality. And then the resoluteness, where you would take upon yourself this situation and face it and actively take charge of your life. Like this whole sequence of events that Heidegger describes Um, I mean, it makes sense that if you would have this deep or like strong experiences of these things, that you could start to rethink your life, and you would have a dramatic go through a kind of a dramatic transformation. But I do think that people have something like an authentic mode of being that don't necessitate these sort of extreme experiences. Like everyone doesn't go for the exact, like everyone that is part of the day. I mean, people don't go for the exact same opinions, the exact same goals and like interpretations. But there are still differences. So like this strong separation of authentic and inauthentic people, I don't think is correct. And it's also worth pointing out that what it means to be authentic in the end, that remains kind of an empty concept in Being in Time. He doesn't say anything about what it means to be authentic and what type of like in practice what it means to live out an authentic experience. It's just about, well, you have to make your own decisions, take charge of your own life and not rely on like the average solutions of the culture. But then you can do whatever you want with that. Only when he goes on to talk about the history or historicity of Dasein does it give some, I would say, very strange and unexpected hints at what the mode of authenticity really contains. Because there's also like an authentic mode of being for a group, which I've mentioned in the previous video about historicity, that it doesn't mean that an entire group, all of them become authentic, but there is some other way in which this works, that maybe they act through an authentic leader, could be. But Heidegger doesn't really say. And so that it opens up to you the possibility to tackle the task of your generation. So authenticity seems to be able to lead to this concrete task that is there for you. But even this task is, well, that is when it is still left open, what that means. And this separation of the inauthentic They and the authentic Dasein, when it grasps itself resolutely, it does make me think of the separation that you could see in the works in Nietzsche's work, and I would say a lot of in Being in Time is reminiscent of Nietzsche, I would say. Especially, I mean, the description of the days seems to dock on pretty well with what Nietzsche called like the herd, where everyone is sort of blending in to become the same. But the authentic Dasein does not, I think, equate to anything that Nietzsche described, like some master or Uberman or anything like that. That one is still just open to like to be authentic can also, it seems like we can be authentically with other people in a way that is kind of like that authentic does, and we being with others would help them in a certain way, that there is an ethical system kind of attached to it, that that you help people by helping themselves and try to almost it seems like authentic Dasein helps other in a way which frees them for their care, which, and I take it like invites them to become authentic themselves. So it would try to create this sort of ripple effect to the community. But in the final analysis, what it means to be authentic remains very much unsaid. In connection to the last point, I would say that there is a consistent rejection in Being and Time of the neutral and universal position of human beings. So in the case of the human being and being in the world, being engaged in the world is part of man's being. There is no independent being of man which then gets put into the world. But engagement with the world is our being. So we don't start from anything neutral there. And we get thrown into the world with all these conditions that we did not choose for ourselves. We had this thrownness and this attunement coming over us. And so we are always coming at life at a certain angle. And we never really get out of that. And this is what Heidegger at one point, I believe, describes as the vicious circle. And we can never get out of this, always coming at life from a certain perspective, but we can sort of get in it in the right way, he says at some point. And he very much is very much against the idea of universality of universality maybe in general. That when it talks about the phenomenon of falling prey and curiosity, that there can arise a temptation to want to learn about all of the world's cultures and to synthesize them into like a universal understanding, and that this is a temptation that belongs to the they. And again, he cannot say that is that is a morally inferior position, but it seems clear that he kind of thinks that it is. That it is something to be kind of looked down upon. That instead of trying to find the universal interpretation, position, culture, task, that you ought to focus on your own life and your own task and your own particular situation. And when it comes to your history, he also seems to suggest that to be authentic, like I said, the authentic concept is very much empty, but it does say at least something about taking upon yourself your history and engaging with it in an authentic way. So that we do kind of inherit things from the past that we have to take upon ourselves. So the idea of like casting aside the past and starting afresh, like from a fresh start in society, seems like it's not something that he advocates for. But that so my question is really if his philosophy boils down to, in the end, a dynamic sort of conflict of different people, kind of what also what Nietzsche seems to describe, that there is no universal path that we all take, and there's not this Hegelian element that things are moving towards this ultimate final destination, but there is only this dynamic, constant, like difference, and people acting on their difference, which gives rise to new phenomenon, that new differences which interact in new ways, but it's all kind of well, not random but arbitrary, and it doesn't converge to a single path. It remains, you could say, polytheistic for Heidegger. That's the way it seems to me. So yeah, as my final remarks, I would just comment on the difficultness of reading Being in Time. Yeah, it was definitely the most torturous book that I've probably ever read. That sometimes you would read a few pages and almost get like a headache of his strange way of writing, and going back over and over again to see, okay, will I get it this time? Or if I go to this source or that source, would it finally make sense to me? But I think the sort of ultimate point in Being in Time, that is, he cannot really like get at it through like propositional knowledge, which is like one of the points, or like his strategies to try to get at this strange question and try to awaken that in us. So but yeah, it is horrible to read it sometimes, and I would not recommend it unless you are very interested in Heidegger in particular. And this whole project has taken a lot longer than I expected, and it was perhaps overly ambitious to try to go over Being in Time in such detail at the same time, when that is not the main thing that I do with my time. This is just a hobby, you could say. So it definitely took a lot longer, and I will think about how to structure my next project based on this experience. But if you've stuck around for all of these videos, then yeah, thank you so much for watching. Bye.